I wake before first light, not that it ever truly arrives in this place. The mist settles on our coastal town long before dawn and lingers well past midday, making every morning feel like a twilight hour. I take my bicycle from the narrow shed behind my small rented cottage, load the stack of rolled newspapers into the front basket, and set out on my route. There is a hush that accompanies me, woven from the sound of water against the distant rocks and the faint calls of seabirds gliding through the fog. I have lived here for half a decade, though I often suspect people barely notice me. I deliver the news each morning to houses that line the winding roads, many perched precariously on the edge of cliffs or tucked into pockets where the ocean spray can't reach. Before we continue, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you love stories that stay with you, hit subscribe so you never miss one. Somehow, the habit of rising early, pedaling through half-lit streets, and placing a paper by each door suits me. It is an unspoken pact. I bring them word of the outside world, but I remain apart from their lives. Day after day, I see small signs of who they are. Handwritten notes pinned to doors, a lone boot left near a broken step, a garden shovel leaning against a fence, but I rarely intrude. The constant fog, which to outsiders feels oppressive, has become a companion to my thoughts. I have grown accustomed to how it cloaks everything, softening angles and dulling colors. Sometimes I pass silhouettes of neighbors standing quietly at their mailboxes, though we exchange no more than a nod or a glance. This layered anonymity is oddly comforting. When I arrived in this town, I brought with me a longing to remain unnoticed, to let the swirl of events pass around me without requiring my active participation. Yet lately, I have questioned this detachment. Perhaps I have glimpsed too many moments of unspoken need, or maybe the hush is wearing thin, revealing something in me that yearns to be known, or at least to matter. Still, I follow the same loop each morning. I begin on Harbour Road, home to the fishery and a small line of cottages with peeling paint. Then I circle up to the old cannery district, mostly empty warehouses now, and from there continue along the coastline until I reach the town's humble center. The grocery store, post office and a lone cafe cluster around a wide main street, often deserted at this hour. Only the seagulls and the persistent sound of lapping water accompany my ride. At times I see broken shells or bits of driftwood washed up along the roadway, left behind by tides that push further inland than one might expect. The ocean and the fog rule this place, and we adapt. I learned this lesson my first week here when a sudden shift in weather brought waves crashing onto the shore, blocking my route. I spent hours perched on a rock, waiting for the road to clear. The memory serves as a reminder that we live at the mercy of forces much larger than ourselves, and perhaps that acceptance fosters a special resilience or a quiet readiness among the people here. In the early days, I paid little attention to the names on the mailboxes. I was content to slip the newspaper inside and move on. Over time, though, the little details demanded my notice. A battered mailbox read S. Riordan, but the garden outside it bloomed with bright daisies even in the damp. Another mailbox displayed K. Briggs in peeling letters, near a porch swing that never seemed to move from its spot. And so these subtle markers formed a map of both the physical streets and the emotional undercurrents of the town. Because of my pre-dawn rounds, I occasionally witness snatches of humanity that others miss. Once I noticed a man pacing in front of his porch as though wrestling with an invisible decision. Another time, I saw a woman sitting on her front steps, head bent, hands clasped, as though she bore a silent weight. I never intruded on these private moments. My gaze would linger for a heartbeat, and I would pedal on, carrying their stories in the back of my mind. Over the years, these ghostly impressions accumulated, weaving a tapestry of quiet longing that I couldn't quite name. Yet the town as a whole carries an air of aloofness. People here tend to their own affairs without prying into one another's. Perhaps the never-ending fog mirrors an unspoken agreement. We do not see too much, and we do not demand too much. This tacit arrangement suited me, until a few weeks ago, when I felt a stirring of unease at the edges of my routine. It was a faint prod, suggesting that maybe standing apart allowed sadness to linger longer than it should, that maybe a single word of kindness could spark a small light in the haze. I recall an instance that triggered this shift. One misty morning, I found a note taped to a mailbox, addressed not to any person but to the newspaper carrier. It read that the occupant would be away for a few days and asked if I could leave the paper inside the screen door instead of at the bottom of the steps. It concluded with a brief apology, something about feeling too weak to bend down repeatedly. Something in the shaky handwriting and the gentle tone unsettled me. I responded in the only way I could think of, by tucking a small encouraging phrase into the newspaper, a tiny slip of paper that read, "Take one step at a time, and may the mist bring you gentle mornings." I wasn't sure if it was appropriate or welcome, but I felt compelled. After that, I noticed other small opportunities. A porch with a broken plank that no one seemed to repair prompted me to leave a few nails and a short note, politely suggesting a fix. A battered pot of hydrangeas drooping in front of a windowsill nudged me to bring a watering can and some fertilizer one early morning. Small gestures, hidden behind anonymity. I told myself it was only goodwill, but I sensed it was more. Part of me wanted to see if I could dispel a corner of this grey hush with some color of compassion. In truth, this subtle shift caused a ripple in my carefully maintained solitude. I found myself pondering what the neighbors might be dealing with behind their fog-shrouded walls. Some had endured heartbreak, loss or disappointment, the sort that might slip unnoticed under the gloom of the weather and the isolation that sets in. Slowly I recognized that choosing kindness over indifference, as minor as it seemed, might be the thread that binds us in a place so dominated by the ocean's hush. Of course, the logic of my old habits whispered that I had no obligation to do more than deliver the news. Still, the unspoken stories hinted that we all share a quiet longing to be seen. With each small act, I realized that my sense of disconnection might have been self-imposed, a shell I adopted when I arrived here with my own burdens. Now a stirring within me suggested that if I extended my hand, even in secrecy, I might find something I had not known I was missing. And so my daily route became something else, a sequence of possibilities. I started imagining ways to show I cared without intruding. Anonymity was comforting, but empathy was calling me to step forward. I felt torn between the pull of hidden kindness and the desire to remain invisible. In many ways, these reflections marked the quiet foundation of what was about to unfold. Little did I know that the delicate balance of our coastal town was about to be tested by an event that would push me further out of my shell, and in the process we would discover how a single choice to care might ripple through the mist, revealing truths we otherwise would have missed. When I look back on that time, I see that it started with no fanfare, just the regular patter of bicycle tires on damp roads and the faint scent of salt water. But beneath the surface calm, something was shifting, preparing to challenge the indifference we all had grown used to. News travels slowly in our town. Despite my daily deliveries, often by the time people read about events, they've already lived them. One morning, though, a particular rumor reached my ears sooner than usual. It began with a note scrawled on a scrap of paper that someone taped to the window of the post office. It mentioned a fisherman who had not returned from his routine midnight outing. The name was not one I recognized immediately, though I might have passed his house 100 times. As I made my rounds, I noticed pockets of anxiety. A shop owner told me, in a hushed tone, that the fisherman's boat was discovered drifting aimlessly near the rocks, sails tattered. No sign of the man himself. She also muttered that few people were doing anything about it. I glimpsed her frustration as she recounted how the authorities had been called, but they gave no reassuring plan. In the background, the fog pressed in, as though sealing off the town from any outside help. The tension was tangible that morning. A postman, sorting through letters, mentioned overhearing that some believed the fisherman had simply decided to leave. Others wondered if a storm had swept him away. I heard second-hand remarks about how he was known to brood on the docks late at night, occasionally sipping from a flask. The distinct possibility emerged that he might have fallen overboard in a moment of inattentiveness. Yet the prevailing sentiment was a resigned shrug, as if tragedy, cloaked in sea brine and fog, was an inevitable part of life here. People seemed reluctant to put forth more than mild concern, as if they feared that prying into another's fate might disturb their own precarious peace. This unsettled me. As I continued pedaling along my route, I wrestled with a disquieting question: was it acceptable for a man's disappearance to be met with half-hearted shrugs? Had we grown too used to the drifting in and out of individuals in a place perpetually hidden by mist? My own pattern of staying aloof tugged at me, reminding me that I had often chosen not to get involved. Yet the fisherman's situation felt like a warning sign, an example of what might happen if we all kept to ourselves indefinitely. By mid-morning, I found myself passing the fisherman's empty house. A battered mailbox bearing faded letters spelled out Urbanes, and the porch steps sagged precariously. No lights were on, not that it mattered much in the gloom. I caught myself craning my neck, as if expecting him to appear. Perhaps, I thought, he had returned quietly, or the entire thing was an overblown misunderstanding. But no movement greeted me, only the faint rustle of wind brushing against the weathered siding. Throughout the day, I noticed that the fisherman's disappearance dominated whispered conversations in the grocery line, outside the church, and near the old cannery. Some lamented that we had no official search party, others implied there was little point. I overheard someone remark that the sea takes as it pleases, and that an in-depth search might only yield heartbreak. Another voice, a bit more callous, suggested the fisherman had debts to pay and might have run off to start anew elsewhere. As the hours stretched, I grew uneasy with the consensus that nothing more could be done. The first stirrings of conflict welled within me, pitting my usual inclination toward detachment against a sense that ignoring this man's fate was not only unkind, but deeply wrong. My mind returned to those small gestures I'd begun making, leaving nails for a broken step, a slip of encouragement for someone who asked for help with the paper. Each was a whisper against the tide of indifference, but the fisherman's disappearance required more than a gentle note. Did I have the resolve to do something? And if so, what? That question haunted me the following morning as I delivered the news. The local paper's front page featured a short mention of the missing boat, accompanied by a terse statement that authorities were looking into it. I dropped the paper on doorsteps and mailboxes, feeling a growing heaviness. It was as though the entire town had slipped into a half-dream, drifting through events without quite acknowledging them. Even my own hands felt uncertain, gripping the bicycle handles, as if I sensed a shift in the air. After finishing my route, I paused at the shoreline near the dock. The sea was calm, if relentlessly grey. Small fishing boats bobbed in the haze, their lights dimly visible. I caught sight of a hunched figure near the water, wrapped in a thick coat. She had a posture that hinted at worry, glancing repeatedly at the horizon. I recognized her from an earlier note pinned to her mailbox, possibly a relative of the fisherman. She appeared to be waiting for something that would not arrive. My instincts told me to remain invisible, not to intrude on her private grief. Yet a gentle voice inside challenged me to break that pattern. I approached, footsteps muffled by the damp sand. Without direct words, I let my presence be known, a careful nod and a look of shared concern. She offered a faint gesture of acknowledgement, then turned her gaze back to the water. Through her body language, I gleaned that she felt helpless and confused. She suspected no one would come forward to lead a search, and she didn't possess the influence or the resources to organize one herself. I could almost hear her thoughts asking why the community was so quick to accept a vanish without a trace scenario. In that silent exchange, I recognized a reflection of my own conflict, the push and pull between wanting to stay hidden behind the morning fog, and sensing that compassion meant stepping into uncomfortable territory. I understood that she was not asking me to solve the mystery of her missing family member, but that she longed for someone to care. So I simply stood there for a while, letting the ocean's rhythms underscore our hush. We parted without direct discussion, yet I left with the unmistakable conviction that allowing this tragedy to fade unnoticed would deepen the gloom that already draped our town. Soon after, a piece of me started forming a plan, albeit a modest one. I decided to slip a note into each newspaper the next morning, a short plea for volunteers to meet at the dock at a certain time, to see if anything could be done. Maybe that meant scouring the coastline for clues, or simply offering moral support to the fisherman's relatives. It felt both bold and absurd, given how well we had all mastered the art of quiet distance. Still, the fisherman's absence weighed on me. I reasoned that if I could encourage a small congregation of neighbors to show up, it might shift something in the air, a push toward kindness in place of resigned indifference. When I wrote the note, the words came out haltingly. I wrote that a group search might be the only real chance at answers, and if that failed, at least the family would see they were not alone. I worried that no one would heed my call. I also worried that people might find it intrusive or naive. Ultimately, I accepted that doing nothing felt worse. Morning arrived in its usual cloak of mist. I tucked the notes into papers before folding them. As I rode, The hidden slips of paper felt like seeds of hope scattered across the entire route. In truth, I had no idea if they would germinate or if they would be tossed aside unread. But with each house, a small spark of possibility fluttered inside me. Something told me that kindness often starts small, hidden from view, and that only time and a willing heart can nurture it into bloom. The rest of that day stretched out in slow uncertainty. I went about my errands, half expecting to see townspeople reading my note and tossing it away. Yet the fog obscured them, and no obvious reaction emerged. I felt the conflict build in me. Was I overstepping my role, meddling in the affairs of strangers who might not want a meddler? Or was this the path I needed to follow, the quiet inclination to transform my vantage point from a distant observer into a compassionate participant? By late afternoon, a persistent drizzle set in, blurring the horizon and making every building look slightly melted. The hush seemed thicker than ever. I found myself imagining the fishermen adrift at sea, or lost in some cove, waiting for a lifeline that no one was certain how to provide. That mental image haunted me, fueling my conviction that ignoring the situation was no different from endorsing it. Yet by the time I returned home, I had no proof that anyone planned to respond to my call. The swirl of conflict tightened around me, a push to become an advocate for kindness, weighed against the possibility that I might stand alone in my efforts. Exhausted, I set my bicycle aside, brewed a cup of tea, and sat by the small window overlooking the narrow street. In the distance, the lamp posts were barely discernible in the mist, pinpricks of faint light. I remembered the woman on the dock and her silent plea for help. If she stood vigil again tonight, I wondered, would my note offer her any solace, or would it vanish into the same grey expanse that seemed to consume everyone else's empathy? These questions gnawed at me, forging the core of my internal strife. I realized that the fisherman's disappearance was not just his story, it was a mirror for the entire community's readiness or reluctance to care for one another. The next morning would reveal whether my quiet attempt at rallying kindness had any effect, or if we would continue drifting, each alone in our own bubble of fog. Dawn arrived with the same muted light, neither fully dark nor truly bright. I set out on my delivery route with a slight tremor of anticipation. My note calling for a gathering at the dock had gone out to every subscriber, yet I had no idea if anyone would read it seriously. As I pedaled, the hush was familiar, but my mindset was not. Usually, I relished the solitude of early mornings. This time I counted each house, hoping someone would step forward to break the silence. At each mailbox, I left a folded newspaper containing that discreet invitation. My mind swirled with thoughts of how intangible these gestures can feel. So many times we assume a single act might vanish without consequence, especially in a place where people keep to themselves. But I clung to the possibility that one or two souls might share my concern. It seemed a fragile thread, but it was the only one I had to tug on if the fisherman's predicament was to be addressed. After completing the route, I cycled back toward the dock. A part of me feared I would find it empty, save for the same lonely silhouettes that often frequented the area. But when I arrived, the sight that greeted me made my heart leap in quiet surprise. A small cluster of neighbors stood in the swirling mist, each holding a lantern or flashlight against the grey gloom. They were far from a large crowd, but more than I expected, people from different corners of town, who it appeared, had read the note and found enough compassion to come. One older man, recognized mainly by the squeaking porch swing near his mailbox, stood with arms folded, scanning the horizon. A younger woman, possibly the relative of the missing fisherman, held a lantern. Another figure was the shop owner, who had confided in me about the authorities' lukewarm efforts. Even from a distance, I sensed her relief that she was not alone. Seeing them gave me a rush of conflicting emotions, gratitude for their presence, fear that I now bore some responsibility for organizing whatever came next. I took a moment to steady my breath, then pushing aside my usual reserve, I moved closer. In low voices, they exchanged updates gleaned from rumors or half-verified sources. The older man mentioned that a few boat owners were willing to do a shoreline sweep if the fog allowed. The younger woman said she had tried to phone distant relatives, but no one knew any new details. Another neighbor said they might start by checking the tidal inlets, pointing out that debris often washes there. It felt odd to stand in a circle of near strangers, unified by concern for a man some of us barely knew. Yet I perceived the hush around us shift, as if the fog itself recognized that apathy was cracking. One by one, we decided on small tasks. Some resolved to search the coastline by foot, looking for signs, a piece of clothing, footprints in the damp sand, anything to indicate the fisherman's path. Others planned to ask for more direct support from local agencies. The group also agreed to set a time to reconvene, to share findings, and keep each other informed. This was no grand rescue mission, but it was a far cry from the shrug of indifference I had seen around town. As the small group dispersed to carry out their plans, I felt an unexpected flicker of hope. Perhaps stepping outside my comfort zone had sparked a collective sense of responsibility. I lingered for a moment, watching them fade into the haze, lanterns bobbing like miniature beacons. The sea remained shrouded in quiet, but something in the air felt changed. For the next several days, this informal search effort continued in pockets around the coastline. I rode my bicycle even earlier, leaving the newspapers faster so I could help comb the beaches. Though I had no formal training in such searches, I walked along the water's edge, scanning for any trace of the fisherman. I discovered strands of seaweed, scattered shells, and the occasional plastic bottle, but no sign of him. Sometimes I met the older man, leaning on a walking stick, peering under weather-beaten driftwood. He paraphrased his frustration at finding only emptiness, remarking that the ocean is large and offers few clues. Despite the lack of immediate results, the camaraderie grew. The members of this makeshift group started exchanging more than polite nods. One evening, after a fruitless search, some of them gathered at the cafe to warm up with coffee. I did not linger inside. My old habits still clung to me, but I stood at the doorway long enough to overhear them quietly discussing how they had once believed themselves powerless. They seemed to appreciate that, by uniting, they were demonstrating that caring for a neighbor did not have to be a grand spectacle. It could be a shared willingness to show up, in small acts day after day. As we trudged through these attempts, the fisherman's family remained an unspoken focal point. Sometimes I caught sight of them, his sister perhaps or a cousin, standing on the docks scanning the wavering horizon. Their expressions were a tangle of sorrow and faint hope. One might say they drew some solace from seeing neighbors walk the shoreline with flashlights, though we never offered them any life-altering revelations. There was a sense that our presence alone meant they were not battling the unknown in isolation. In my own heart, each step along the damp sand magnified my realization that choosing kindness over indifference extends beyond an individual gesture. It forges unseen connections, reminding people that they are not merely ghosts drifting through the fog. I thought of how the fisherman's plight had jolted us awake from our communal lethargy. Though the outcome was uncertain, I felt proud that we tried. Even in the face of the ocean's immensity, apathy was no longer our default. Those days also sharpened my awareness of the symbolic nature of our town's endless mist. It was as though the fog represented the emotional barriers between us, each person sealed in a private bubble. But as we banded together, searching for a lost man, we pierced those barriers. We still stumbled through limited visibility, yet we now recognized each other's silhouettes. Our scattered lanterns, literal and metaphorical, hinted at the possibility of warmth in a landscape that once felt unremittingly gray. Strange as it may sound, I also caught glimpses of personal healing in others. The shop owner, who once appeared hardened by disappointment, commented that maybe the fisherman's tragedy reminded her how fleeting life can be. She paraphrased the idea to a neighbor: if we wait for perfect conditions to care, we may wait forever. Another volunteer, an older woman whose name I learned was Dahlia, revealed she had lost a brother at sea decades ago. She admitted, through a tremor in her voice, that she never shared that grief with anyone here because it felt pointless. Now she discovered a sense of belonging in the group, as though the simple act of searching let her honor her brother's memory. Though I rarely spoke much during these gatherings, my own timidity still a factor, I listened and absorbed. It occurred to me that perhaps my earlier life in this town, delivering newspapers while maintaining near invisibility, shielded me from deeper connections, but also starved me of them. The fisherman's story became a catalyst, pushing me past the threshold of comfortable detachment. One late afternoon, while scanning a stretch of rocky shoreline, I stumbled on a small patch of broken wood. For a moment my pulse quickened, wondering if this was wreckage from the missing boat, but on closer inspection, it looked like debris from an old crate or pallet. Still, the moment captured the hope and dread that accompanied our search. Each piece of flotsam felt like it could solve the mystery or deepen it. That evening, a few of us met again at the dock to report any findings. The sum total was meager, a handful of inconclusive scraps and more questions, yet no one seemed ready to give up. Standing by the water in that waning light, I felt a sense of unity. People who had once been content to remain strangers now greeted each other by name, asked about each other's well-being, and quietly shared provisions, coffee in thermoses, a box of pastries, a comforting pat on the shoulder. I realized that we might never find the fisherman alive, or even at all. The sea might keep its secrets. What mattered was that, for the first time, the community was showing up, refusing to let a neighbor's disappearance pass as a trivial footnote in the daily paper. I thought about the headlines I delivered each morning, and how they rarely captured the full humanity behind the facts. Now, I was living a story that would likely appear as just another local tragedy. But for those of us on the ground, it was a shift in our way of being, an effort to choose empathy over the easy path of resignation. As I pedaled home in the half-darkness, a gentle drizzle coated my jacket and the bicycle's frame. The fog thickened, but my spirits did not plunge into the usual solemn hush. Instead, I sensed a persistent glow that no drizzle could extinguish. It was the light of mutual care, however fragile. I knew the real test lay ahead. Storms, personal doubts, and the slow grind of searching might erode our resolve. The fisherman's situation was not a neat puzzle with a guaranteed solution. Yet in that in-between moment, I believed we had kindled something precious that might see us through the trials yet to come. Just as the search efforts began forming a routine, people discussing leads, combing sections of coastline, reconvening to trade updates, a sudden shift in the weather rattled our tenuous sense of progress. Word spread quickly that a storm was approaching, fiercer than any we had witnessed in months. Wind advisories crackled on the local radio station, warning fishermen to anchor their boats and coastal residents to stay indoors. The mere mention of a heavy storm in a fog-laden town raised alarms, since rainfall and gusts of wind can reduce visibility from minimal to nearly non-existent. Late one afternoon, grey clouds rolled in like an advancing curtain, blotting out what little light we usually receive. I was halfway through my deliveries when distant thunder rumbled across the bay. Rain began to fall in large cold droplets, mixing with the omnipresent mist until everything became a swirl of water and shifting shapes. The wind picked up, tugging at the edges of my jacket and nearly toppling me from the bicycle. It felt like nature itself was orchestrating a crisis to test us. I realized I would have to abandon the second half of my route or risk being caught in a dangerous downpour. Yet an uneasy thought tugged at me. Some of the search volunteers might still be out there following the coastline, unprepared for the sudden onslaught. I recalled how the older man with the walking stick mentioned he would check an outcropping of rocks near an inlet. Another neighbor had planned to trek a ways up the beach in case the tide revealed new debris. Would they be safe? With the wind howling, I leaned my bike against a battered fence near a storage shed and decided to make my way toward the dock on foot. My logic, if it could be called that, was to see if any of the volunteers had taken shelter there. Perhaps we could pool our resources, or at least confirm that everyone was accounted for. The drumming of rain on the rooftops drowned my footsteps, and the gloom thickened until I had to strain to see beyond a few yards. I pressed on, guided by the faint memory of the path. When I reached the dock, the scene was alarming. Waves crashed violently against the worn planks, sending spray into the air. In the distance, I spotted a figure trying to secure a small fishing boat against the storm. My heart pounded, worried that a sudden gust might sweep them into the roiling sea. Then I noticed another form, hunched near a crate, possibly trying to steady themselves. Even from a distance, I sensed their desperation. Summoning courage I did not fully feel, I ventured onto the swaying dock. Water sloshed over my shoes, chilling my ankles. I recognized the second figure as the young woman who had first appeared at the fisherman's house, his younger sister, I believed. She was shielding her face from the rain, fumbling with a tangled rope. She looked at me with startled relief, as if uncertain how to handle the boat alone. Without words, I grabbed the rope and helped her tighten it around a mooring post. Through the roar of wind, I caught fragments of her concern that if they left the boat unsecured, it might drift away or crash, losing any chance to continue searching once the storm passed. Together, we managed to stabilize the vessel. In that chaos, I felt my own vulnerability. A sudden swirl of water nearly knocked me off balance, but the young woman steadied me, revealing a raw determination in her eyes. At that moment, I realized how seldom I had truly engaged with another person's emotions since arriving in this town. The fisherman's sister conveyed, through anxious gestures, that she feared the worst for her brother, but she also feared what the storm might do to the small fragment of his life that remained, his boat. When we were sure the ropes were secure, we spotted a third person further along the dock, calling out something we could barely decipher over the wind. I recognized the voice as belonging to the older man with the walking stick. He had braved the weather to see if the storm had washed anything ashore that might lead us to the missing fisherman. The sound of his voice carried a mix of worry and a faint hope that the sea might finally reveal a clue, even in the midst of its fury. The three of us clung to whatever we could find, half blinded by sheets of rain, forging our way off the dock. Yet the swirling water made each step precarious. Twice, the older man lost his balance, and the young woman and I grabbed him just in time. My muscles strained as I fought to keep him upright. The strength it took to walk a short distance felt monumental, reminiscent of how an act of kindness can seem daunting in a world that resists closeness. Suddenly, a large wave crashed against the far edge of the dock, sending wooden planks groaning. The older man flinched, fear etched on his face. I imagined how one misstep could drag any of us under. A surge of adrenaline coursed through me, propelling me to hurry the others to higher ground. We stumbled forward, drenched to the bone. Each yard felt like a small victory. By the time we reached a cluster of crates stacked against a warehouse, the exhaustion was palpable. We crouched there, shivering, eyes scanning the raging waters. In that moment, the fisherman's sister, breath quivering, paraphrased a thought. She had no idea what would become of her brother, but she was grateful not to face the storm alone. A few days ago, she added, she felt abandoned by the entire town. Now at least a handful of us had shown up, refusing to let her shoulder everything by herself. Her words struck me deep, reminding me of how quiet gestures can merge into a life-saving rope when the storm breaks. The older man, leaning on his walking stick, managed to steady his breath enough to say that nobody should have to face such fear without a friend. He recounted a time, in truncated phrases, when a younger version of himself had been saved by a stranger during an unexpected squall. He hinted that this memory was why he answered the call in the paper, seeing it as a chance to repay a karmic debt. As I listened, I felt the full force of the storm raging around us, yet a poignant calm formed in my chest. This was the climax, the point where external chaos converged with the internal conflict of whether to extend ourselves for one another. Within that swirl of rain, wind, and helplessness, we had become each other's lifeline. The fisherman's sister no longer faced her ordeal alone. The older man was able to protect others as he once had been protected, and I found within myself a resolve that dwarfed my former desire for anonymity. Once we regained enough strength, we navigated our way off the dock entirely, moving inland toward a warehouse that offered partial shelter. The storm raged for what seemed like hours, pounding the rooftops and sending rivers of runoff through the streets. Inside that makeshift refuge, we sat in damp clothing, hearts pounding. Occasionally, we exchanged uneasy glances about the missing fisherman, wondering if this tempest would bury any chance of finding him. Yet in that shared vulnerability, we recognized that we had already prevented another tragedy by keeping each other safe. Eventually, the wind abated slightly, though the rain continued to drum. We did not attempt to re-enter the waterlogged dock. Instead, we waited, telling ourselves that surviving the night was the immediate priority. And in that wait, a sense of solidarity sprouted. Here, battered by gusts and drenched in mist, we learned that forging a bond of kindness was not an abstract notion. It was the difference between standing alone in terror and standing together with hope. By the time the storm began to ease, darkness had swallowed the horizon. We emerged to find the dock battered but still intact. The fisherman's boat remained tied, bobbing under the moonless sky. Though our bodies ached, we silently affirmed that we would return in the morning to see what more could be done. Our endurance in the storm had forged an unspoken understanding. we were, for better or worse, a community that chose to care. The missing man was no longer a passing headline. He was one of us, lost in the same swirling fog we once used to hide ourselves from each other. I realized that the storm, for all its destruction, had revealed something vital, a willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for another's well-being. And that, I believed, might become the turning tide in a place so often tempted by apathy. The morning after the storm brought a peculiar stillness to our coastal town. The fog was as dense as ever, yet there was a subdued hush that felt different, as though the weather's fury had worn down our walls of detachment. I ventured out early to complete my usual paper delivery, half expecting to see signs of chaos in the streets. Instead, I found scattered debris, branches, seaweed, bits of driftwood, but also glimpses of neighbors helping each other clear away the mess. On one corner, a man and woman I recognized from previous search gatherings were piling ruined planks onto a cart. A short distance away, the grocery store owner offered hot tea to a passerby whose boots were caked in mud. Everywhere I looked, I sensed subdued exhaustion laced with genuine support. People were not boisterous or celebratory. Rather, they performed tasks with quiet solidarity, evidence of the connection that had emerged amid adversity. Once I finished delivering newspapers, I decided to stop by the fisherman's house. I did not know if his sister would be there, but I felt compelled to see if she needed anything. As I approached the weathered porch, I noticed a neat row of lanterns someone had left. Perhaps they were from the volunteers who had used them the night before. On the door, a small sign read, "Knock, but please forgive me if I can't answer quickly." The line carried a gentle request for patience, as if she was still grappling with aftermaths, both emotional and physical. I stood for a moment, uncertain whether to intrude. In the end, I placed a folded note on the porch, a simple message that I was thinking of her and that I could assist if needed. My earlier anonymity, once a shield, now felt less necessary. I still avoided direct intrusion, but I no longer assumed that stepping aside was best. Before departing, I glanced at the empty horizon, half hoping the fisherman might emerge. The water was calm, reflecting the pervasive grey of the sky. Later that day, our informal search group congregated by the dock. Despite the storm's lingering dampness, the mood was more resolute than despairing. The older man with the walking stick recounted how he had once seen a small dinghy get washed into a hidden cove after a storm, suggesting we expand our search to nearby inlets. Another volunteer, the shop owner, said she would speak to local boat owners about scanning the coastline further north. No one harbored illusions that the fishermen would be easily found, but they carried on with a sense of purpose. I joined a small subset that chose to walk the shoreline in the opposite direction, toward the rocky cliffs. The sea's edges were strewn with kelp and shattered shells, evidence of the storm's power. With each step we scanned for anything the ocean might have yielded. I gathered fragments of driftwood, occasionally pausing to examine them for any sign they belonged to the fisherman's boat. My mind buzzed with empathy for his sister, who lived in a limbo of uncertainty. I thought about how helpless we all were against the open sea. Yet being here, combing the shore in unity, was an act of defiance against the impulse to give up. As we progressed, the conversation among the group turned reflective. One person said that the fisherman's disappearance reminded him of his own father, who had left town years ago, never to return. Another mentioned that the storm had been a wake-up call, showing them how easily they could lose someone or something if they remained apathetic. Listening to these admissions, I felt a quiet kinship form, bridging the invisible gaps that had once kept us from truly seeing each other. By early afternoon, we reconvened at the dock. No groundbreaking discoveries had emerged from our search. The ocean, it seemed, was uninterested in offering closure. Some volunteers departed with tired nods, heading to their own tasks or families. Others lingered, exchanging phone numbers or addresses, an unusual gesture in a town accustomed to anonymity. The fisherman's sister was absent, presumably resting or managing her sorrow in private. I silently hoped she was aware that no one was ready to abandon the search. In the days that followed, the intensity of the search lessened, people had jobs and responsibilities, and the daily grind resumed. However, the difference was that no one forgot about the missing man. Even as we returned to routine, small pockets of neighbors continued to explore lesser-known inlets or parted with a bit of money to fund boat fuel for scanning the coast. The shop owner placed a box by her register for donations, a sign overhead explaining it was to support ongoing search efforts. A modest collection of coins and small bills soon piled up. During this transitional period, I found myself reflecting on my own transformation. Initially, I had settled in this fog-bound town to remain invisible, delivering newspapers without forging attachments. Yet the fisherman's crisis, and the subsequent storm, pulled me into the orbit of community, in a way I never anticipated. My mind flashed to those early pre-dawn rides, when I felt content to observe from a distance. Now I realized that forging deeper ties did not necessarily mean losing oneself. If anything, it expanded the scope of one's heart, allowing pockets of empathy to flourish. One particularly damp morning, while delivering papers, I encountered Dahlia, the older woman who once spoke of losing her brother at sea. She was lugging a bag of groceries on her porch. She paused when she saw me, and in a subdued tone she paraphrased that she appreciated how the search had awakened her sense of community after all these years. Though she didn't say much more, the meaning behind her words was clear. By caring for the fisherman's fate, she was also healing a small wound in her own life. In these and other moments, I sensed that the fisherman's disappearance, while tragic, had served as a catalyst. People who once accepted the persistent mist as an excuse to ignore each other, now found it more natural to exchange gestures of kindness. I delivered the news each morning, but now the recipients occasionally left me small tokens, a tea bag on the mailbox lid, a homemade biscuit wrapped in foil, or a short letter expressing thanks. A neighbor's note read simply, "Your message in the paper was the first time I felt connected in months." Another wrote, "We cannot bring him back, but we can support each other. Your efforts help me see that." As the days slid into weeks, the question of the fisherman's ultimate fate lingered, a shadow that would not fully lift. The authorities, minimal as they were, issued a brief statement, suggesting the case might be closed soon if no conclusive evidence surfaced. In response, the local group continued to meet occasionally, refusing to let the matter fade. Even if we never found him, we had chosen to care, and that choice itself became a statement about who we wanted to be in this cloistered coastal town. During one quiet afternoon, I stood near the place where the fisherman's boat had been found drifting. The water lapped softly against the shore, and the mist hung low, as though it might touch the sea's surface any moment. My mind wandered to the swirl of events, the initial rumor of his disappearance, the note I placed in every paper, the storm that tested our resolve, and the aftermath. In that introspective hush, I recognized a profound lesson in the daily decisions we make. Each time we choose kindness over indifference, we dismantle a small piece of the barrier between us. I remembered how, in my earliest days here, I believed my best option was to remain unseen, to slip in and out before the town stirred. Now I saw the mistake in equating invisibility with peace. True peace, I realized, might come from the willingness to step closer to someone else's pain, because it affirms our shared humanity. We cannot dissolve the endless fog that defines the weather, but we can lessen the emotional fog that keeps us apart. With the fisherman's whereabouts still unknown, the community learned to live with the uncertainty. Neighbors who used to ignore each other now offered a wave, a greeting, or a soft inquiry about how the day was going. It was not a dramatic transformation, but a gentle shift that carried the promise of lasting impact. The fisherman's sister sometimes appeared at the dock, flanked by one or two supporters, who asked if she needed fresh groceries or a ride into the next town. Even the older man with the walking stick said he slept better at night, knowing that a measure of solidarity lay just across the street if he needed help. Thus the storm's aftermath brought not closure, but a sense of cautious hope. Beneath the muted sky, we began to accept that life does not always grant tidy endings. Instead, it nudges us toward each other, inviting us to discover a greater depth to our shared experiences. In that unspoken invitation, I found a kind of fulfillment I had never thought to seek, the realization that my role extended beyond delivering headlines. I could also deliver subtle reminders that caring for one another, though easy to dismiss in troubled times, has the power to reshape how we exist together. By the time the day's light dimmed, I felt lighter. True, the fisherman's story remained unresolved, but the tide within our community had begun to shift. Kindness, once sporadic and hidden, was weaving itself more openly into our routines, dissolving a portion of the fog that kept us isolated in our own worlds. Months slipped by, and our coastal town settled into a new rhythm. The fisherman's mystery persisted, never fully solved, yet never forgotten. Occasionally, fresh rumors circulated, a piece of wood washing ashore that might belong to his boat, or a reported sighting of a lone figure along a distant beach. None provided a definitive answer. In most towns, such a disappearance might fade into the archives, but here, it became part of our collective memory, a cautionary tale that bonded us more than any tidy resolution could. I continued my daily routine, rising before dawn to deliver the news. The mist, as relentless as ever, enveloped me on each ride, yet I no longer perceived it as a mere barrier. Somewhere in its swirling depths, I imagined countless acts of unspoken empathy being exchanged. A neighbor bringing groceries to a shut-in, a volunteer delivering fresh blankets to someone who'd lost theirs in the storm, or a passerby pausing to chat with an elderly resident hungry for conversation. These glimpses of compassion might be small, but they revealed that the community was evolving. At times I still cherished the solitude of early mornings, the sense of being the only one awake in a sleeping world, but I no longer felt compelled to remain invisible. Occasionally, I stopped to greet a neighbor retrieving their paper. We would exchange a few words, usually paraphrased updates on how they were faring, or mutual concern about a forecasted storm. While these moments were brief, they hinted at a newfound trust. People recognized me, and I recognized them, bridging the divide that once shrouded us in emotional fog. The fisherman's sister became a more familiar figure around town. She seldom spoke extensively about her loss, but she seemed grateful for every small kindness extended her way. Sometimes, I spotted her near the dock at sunrise, gazing at the water. No one pestered her with false assurances. Instead, they offered presence, an acknowledgement that sorrow and hope can coexist, and that neither has to be borne alone. Dahlia, the older woman who had once lost her brother at sea, found renewed purpose in supporting the fisherman's sister. She confided to me, in a hushed tone one afternoon, that by listening to someone else's grief, she had learned to process her own. This admission reminded me that healing often arrives through shared experiences rather than solitary silence. It also underscored how, by opening ourselves to others' hardships, we can inadvertently mend parts of our own lives. As for the rest of the town, subtle signs of transformation dotted the landscape. The cafe, once deserted in off-hours, now attracted a modest trickle of patrons who exchanged neighborly updates or collaborated on small community projects, like clearing debris from the beach or repainting the battered fences near the harbor. The local store owner who displayed a donation box for search efforts never removed it, converting it into a general fund for those facing sudden emergencies. I frequently saw coins clinking into that box, a gentle testament to the ongoing willingness to help. Reflecting on these shifts, I recognized that we still lived in a world of partial visibility. Our environment remained a puzzle of fog and drifting tides, and many personal struggles stayed concealed behind closed doors. But something significant had changed in our collective mindset. We had chosen to be watchful, not as voyeurs, but as potential helpers. Instead of turning a blind eye when a neighbor was in distress, more people now stepped forward with a question or a gesture of support. It was as though the fisherman's disappearance had awakened an understanding that we are all adrift in one way or another, and empathy is the rope that keeps us tethered. Meanwhile, I continued to slip small, heartening notes into select newspapers, especially if I sensed someone needed a word of encouragement. Once in a while, someone left a response pinned to their mailbox, thanking me for the thought. These exchanges, though anonymous to an extent, formed a secret dialogue between kindred spirits. I came to see the entire routine of delivering newspapers as more than a job. It was a conduit for weaving hope into the everyday rhythms of our foggy home. Eventually, my curiosity about what else I might do spurred me to volunteer at a small reading circle organized in the local library. Initially, my intention was to remain on the fringes, observing, but I soon found myself engaging with residents I had only known from their mailboxes or a fleeting glance on the street. A handful recognized me as the one who had distributed the note requesting people to gather at the dock, and they expressed gratitude in quiet phrases. I felt a sense of belonging that eluded me in my earlier life here, and I realized that choosing kindness over indifference was not just a moral stance, but also a path to genuine community. As time wore on, people occasionally asked if we had given up on finding the fisherman. My reply, paraphrased each time, was that we had not given up on remembering him, even if we no longer scoured every inch of coastline. This statement carried the weight of acceptance that the sea might never yield a clear answer, acceptance that life's mysteries often remain unresolved, and acceptance that our best response is to stay open-hearted, even in the face of unanswered questions. On a brisk evening, I found myself standing at the cliff's edge, watching the sun dip into the horizon, though its outline was barely perceptible through the mist. I let the breeze ruffle my hair, inhaling the damp air that tasted of salt and longing. My thoughts drifted to how far I had come from the solitary figure who once contented herself with silent observation. I had learned that even the smallest act of concern, a note, a shared search, a rescue in the storm, can ripple through a place that seemed hopelessly secluded. Recalling the fisherman's sister Dahlia, the older man with the walking stick, and many others who quietly joined forces to chase the flicker of hope, I felt a swelling in my chest. It was neither sorrow nor pure joy, but a recognition of life's poignancy. In that reflection I understood that every kind gesture we make, no matter how modest, is a form of light in the fog, an assurance to ourselves and others that we are not alone. With that realization came a renewed sense of purpose. The next morning, I rose earlier than ever. I retrieved the stack of newspapers and my usual scraps of encouraging notes, but I also added a new twist. I included short lines from poems I loved, or reflective observations that could stir the mind. As I delivered the papers, I placed these snippets where readers might spot them. It felt like sprinkling seeds of empathy across a land that had shown itself capable of nurturing them. Passing each mailbox or doorstep, I remembered how unsure I once felt about reaching out at all. Now the hush of the early hour felt inviting, a canvas upon which I could quietly paint gestures of compassion. The endless mist was still there, but it no longer signified isolation. Instead, I saw it as the backdrop to an ongoing story of subtle transformations, proof that though we cannot banish uncertainty, we can choose not to let it isolate us. By midday, I had completed my tasks and decided to pause near the same dock where so many pivotal moments had unfolded. The water lapped gently against the posts, carrying fragments of sunlight that broke through the haze. I thought of the fisherman and sent a silent wish that wherever he might be, he had found some measure of peace. Then I thought of the townspeople who had emerged from the woodwork to care, each in their own way. The memory of that night's storm, when we clung to each other to avoid being swept away, served as a testament to what we could accomplish by confronting apathy. In that quiet reflection, I recognized that the story would go on. Our coastal town would continue to experience storms, figurative and literal. People would still vanish, whether by tragedy or by choice, yet our response need not be resignation. We had discovered that small, steady acts of kindness could hold us together in ways we never expected. And I, the once invisible newspaper delivery woman, had found a surprising calling to carry the light of compassion forward, even when the mist refused to lift. As I stepped away from the dock, I felt no grand certainty, only a gentle assurance that I had chosen a better path. The morning's deliveries were done, but the real work of caring, of showing up, would continue indefinitely. And in a place perpetually shrouded by fog, that steady flame of kindness might just be the most enduring beacon we have. We create stories that linger, stories that make you reflect, feel, and see life from a new perspective. If you seek stories with real depth and meaning, subscribe now. The next one will take you even deeper. Click to experience it now.